The patrol car crawled along the frozen roadside as the headlights cut through the Siberian dark. Snow blew sideways in thin, fast streaks, and the temperature had dropped so low that every breath inside the vehicle fogged the windshield. The woman walking alone didn't hear the car approach behind her. She kept her arms wrapped tight across her chest, shivering as she moved along the edge of the road leading out of Angarsk. When the car stopped beside her, she hesitated for only a moment before leaning down toward the window. The officer behind the wheel looked familiar, someone she had seen around town. His uniform, his calm voice, and the warmth pouring from the open door made the offer of a ride feel safe enough. She stepped inside, thinking she had escaped the cold. She didn't know the danger had just begun. In those years, Mikhail Popkov moved through the streets of Angarsk with the authority of a man the public trusted. He had spent his career in law enforcement, responding to domestic disputes, traffic accidents, missing person reports, and late-night calls from frightened residents. He played the part well. Neighbors described him as polite. Fellow officers thought he was dependable. To the people who saw him patrolling the quiet neighborhoods, he seemed like the kind of officer who took his job seriously. No one imagined that the same man who collected statements and filed reports was also choosing targets late at night, using his badge and uniform to convince vulnerable women that they were safe. Most of his victims were women who found themselves alone after dark. Some were leaving late shifts. Some had been drinking in small, smoky bars scattered around town. Others were simply trying to walk home. When Popkov approached in his patrol car, they saw an officer offering help. He told them it wasn't safe to walk alone in the cold, that he could give them a lift. It was believable. He knew the streets. He knew the isolated dirt turnoffs that wound behind industrial lots and into the forest. He knew how to use his uniform as a shield against suspicion. Once they were inside the car, he drove away from the city lights. The victims realized too late that something was wrong. By the time the vehicle stopped on a remote trail or a frozen clearing, the doors were locked, and Popkov was no longer the calm, steady officer people knew from daylight. The violence that followed was brutal, and when it was over, he left the women in secluded patches of forest or brush, places far from traffic, where snowstorms or changing seasons concealed evidence for months. Bodies began appearing in the early 1990s. Local detectives saw patterns but struggled to put them into words at first. The victims were typically found outdoors, often unclothed, and the cause of death was usually extreme force. The murders happened near the edges of Angarsk, along roads that stretched toward forests and factory zones. Some officers suspected a serial killer was operating in the area, but the idea was unsettling enough that others resisted it. In a region where people were already used to hardship, the notion that a predator was hunting women late at night created a fear that spread quietly through the town. Case files grew thicker. Patrol logs, autopsy notes, and maps with pins marking dump sites began to suggest a single offender moving through familiar territory. Investigators considered suspects ranging from factory workers to truck drivers to outsiders passing through. But the possibility that the person responsible wore a uniform made people uneasy. Popkov understood how his department worked. He knew how evidence was processed and which details mattered most to detectives. He avoided leaving behind obvious forensic traces. He changed his routes. He changed the times and locations of attacks. When the killings slowed for periods of time, some investigators believed the threat had passed. They were wrong. Popkov's dual life created unusual gaps in the investigation. He attended meetings where detectives discussed the murders. He listened to theories about the killer's habits. At one point, he even joined search efforts, walking through wooded areas looking for evidence he already knew wasn't there. When colleagues talked about their fear of another attack, he nodded along, offering quiet agreement. The more he blended in, the harder he became to identify. As the years passed, Popkov left the police force for other work, but his crimes continued. The profile built by analysts described someone methodical, physically strong, familiar with law enforcement practices, and capable of moving victims without drawing attention. The list narrowed, but not enough. Popkov appeared too ordinary to fit the image of a serial killer. He had a family. He attended events. He kept a routine. For a long time, that was enough to keep suspicion away from him. By the late 2000s, investigators had access to improved forensic tools. DNA evidence from several crime scenes established links among murders spanning more than a decade. Cold case units revisited older files. When a partial genetic sample led them toward former officers, Popkov's name surfaced. It was a small lead, but it was the first solid connection to someone with both the physical access and the knowledge to commit the crimes. Detectives decided to question him. They drove to the remote town where he now lived and approached him casually, presenting the meeting as a routine follow-up. Popkov greeted them politely. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He seemed almost resigned. When confronted with the DNA evidence, his composure shifted only slightly. After a pause, he admitted he had cleansed the streets of immoral women, a phrase that revealed the distorted justification he had created for himself. Once he began talking, the admissions came steadily. He described scenes investigators had long struggled to piece together. He remembered dates, locations, and victims with unsettling clarity. His confessions stunned even seasoned detectives. The number of murders he acknowledged far exceeded their expectations. Court records initially confirmed dozens, but as interviews continued, he provided details of cases that had never been connected or solved. Over time, authorities linked him to one of the highest-known victim counts in modern Russian history. Each new disclosure forced investigators to reopen old files, re-examine remains, and revisit families who had lived for years without answers. Popkov showed little emotion during interrogations. He spoke about his crimes as though he were describing routine patrol work. The contrast between the uniform he once wore and the brutality he carried out behind the authority of that uniform left many officers shaken. The betrayal ran deep. He had used the very position meant to protect the public as a tool to isolate and kill. In court, relatives of victims confronted him, demanding explanations he could not give. Some had waited more than a decade for the truth. Many learned for the first time how their loved ones had been lured, abducted, and left in remote places. Popkov rarely looked up as they spoke. Sentencing hearings stretched on as more cases were confirmed, each one adding years to the punishment he would never outlive. Investigators continued interviewing him long after the trial. Each conversation revealed more names, more nights, more stretches of road where he had preyed on women who believed the badge on his chest meant safety. The full scale of his crimes forced the region to re-examine how easily a predator had blended into a system built on trust. Popkov spent the rest of his life in a high-security facility, far from the town he once patrolled. The forests and roads where he had carried out his attacks eventually changed with time, but the memory of what had happened there stayed sharp for those who had lost someone. His case became a grim study in how a man who appeared to serve the public could hide behind that appearance for years, leaving devastation that stretched across generations. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.